Hello. And welcome to ProTrain's Earned Value Professional EVP Preparation course. In this foundation lecture we will talk about risk management. Let us get started. Introduction. Risk management is an important tool in the management of projects. While risk management has a long history when it comes to its research, development and implementation, but in current business environment it is one of the prime focus knowledge areas. Now the question arises, what is risk management? Well, I'm sure you are not listening to the term risk management first time. You would have a decent knowledge about what is risk management. Even the term suggests that the risk management is all about managing risks. Now coming specific to risk management in context of capital projects. These projects are both complex and complicated in nature. This means there are a lot of unknowns and uncertainties in such projects. Projects deal with uncertainties. This has effect on many different aspects of project performance and delivery. Risk management allows us to provide processed and approached to manage project uncertainties. Now, in order to have a focused discussion, let us understand how professional bodies like Project Management Institute defines risk management. Project Management Body of Knowledge, PMBOK, 4th edition issued by Project Management Institute, PMI, describes risk management as the processes of conducting risk management planning, identification, analysis, response planning, and monitoring and control on a project. The objectives of project risk management are to increase the probability and impact of positive events, and decrease the probability and impact of negative events in the project. We can define risk as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on a project's objectives. And risk management as process framework for identifying the risks, doing response planning and monitoring and control. In this lecture we will understand such processes and tools in detail. Risk management benefits. Good risk management practices bring lots of benefit on the table. All organizations need to deal with risks. There are many examples of failed projects and companies that were unable to deal with risks. One of the greatest risks to projects is the lack of adequate and appropriate planning. An important part of project planning is risk management. Risk management in all its forms, both simple and complex, will potentially have a positive effect on the implementation of projects. Risk management will also assist projects where the risk was not identified or anticipated. By using risk management, projects will develop techniques and methods to deal with both anticipated and unanticipated events. Fundamental approach to risk management. When we perform risk management, we should keep in mind the following. You don't need an advanced degree in mathematical theory to perform risk management. Risk management can be applied in different ways, suitable to project needs from easy simple to complex. One of the important elements of risk management is to establish a process for dealing with risks. The fundamental approach to risk management is to identify the risks to project success, assess and analyze the risks, and develop plans to mitigate it. Risk management usually follows the following sequence. Identification. Assessment. Analysis. Mitigation. This risk management lecture will provide an overview of the process and examples of how to apply the tools of risk management. Learning objectives. After completing this lecture, students should gain a general understanding of risk management. Learn about techniques of identifying risk items, assessing risk items in terms of occurrence and impact, and analyzing risk. Learn about risk mitigation. Learn about quantitative risk analysis, i.e. simulation, sensitivity analysis, and decision trees. Learn about risk analysis software. And find out about the use of contingency. Risk management steps. There are numerous ways of risk management, so are the risk management steps. While different management thinkers and practitioners may define risk management in slightly different ways from the others, all the risk management activities can be ascribed to following steps. 1. Risk planning. 2. Risk identification. 3. Risk assessment. 4. Analysis. 5. Mitigation. And 6. Follow-up. Before getting into the complex part of risk management, and how it is implemented at project level, let's first understand what we mean by risk management in simple terms on more time using an example. Say, you are going to your project site, and there are two different ways or routes to reach there. Route 1, which is slightly longer but there shall be no traffic. Route 2, this is a short route to reach the site but there can be traffic congestions which may take up to additional 30 minutes to an hour. In order to choose a route, you will weigh the probability of occurrence of traffic congestions based on your experience, the time of your travel, etc., and you shall choose the appropriate route. Choosing the most suitable route is nothing but risk management. In the first step you identified risk of traffic congestion. In the second step you did an assessment that the risk of traffic congestion may lead to certain delay. In the step 3, you analyze the chances of occurrence of the traffic congestion, and the delay impact. And, in the last step, based on analysis you choose to find the way to mitigate this risk by choosing the appropriate route. Risk management in the projects are more complex than this simple example. However, the underlying principles and philosophies remain same. We shall discuss each step and how they are implemented in a project setting in detail in upcoming sections of the lecture. Risk planning. Prior to beginning risk management, it is appropriate to review the risk management plan as outlined in the project plan, project execution plan, or project coordination procedure. If nothing has been done in this regard, it should be started. Risk planning in its broadest scope should establish the approach, form, content and results of risk management. Depending on the project, this can range from 1 to dozens of pages of content with any number of attachments, forms, and checklists. It is important to establish what is to be covered by risk management. A mission statement and scope of work description are essential in this regard. The scope of risk management should include the basis of including external, internal, strategic, and tactical risks. Risk planning should also establish criteria for risk identification items. assessment criteria for occurrence and impact, analysis approaches, and general mitigation strategies. In addition, responsibilities of risk mitigation and follow-up should be identified. Risk identification. Risk identification is the most common step in risk management. In this step, the project risks are identified. By doing so, the risk management on projects is reduced to a more objective level. One view of risk management is to widen the approach to include both negative risks and positive items opportunities. Identifying positive outcomes gives the project the opportunity to improve performance or lower costs. The first step in risk identification is to assemble a list of project risks. There are many techniques to putting together a risk identification list. These are authored by one person. The person may be risk manager or project manager. Authored by a team with surveys and interviews. Circulate a chart where risk items can be added by each person. Free-form list put together by a group at a meeting, for example, a brainstorming session. And a list developed by a group facilitated by a third party. The use of a small focused group is a good approach to assembling a risk identification list. The interactions among members of the group are generally very productive. Discussion about risk items leads to identifying new items that may not have been developed in an isolated setting. In risk identification, it is better to be inclusive and ensure capturing more risks, rather than try and manage the risk item editing at too early a stage. An important aspect of identifying risk management items is to clearly communicate or show the scope of work by summaries. Such summaries can be made in line with Project Work Breakdown Structure or WBS. Creativity is also helpful in ensuring the identification of risks is as complete as possible. Inclusion of people outside the project may also be helpful in making the list complete. Editing of the list occurs later rather than during identification. Identification items may be classified into groups, depending on how the project is set up. It is desirable to have items that would be clearly the responsibility of an organizational group or individual. Elements of risk identification can include the following. Statement of the problem issue risk. Short description of the risk. Identification of the fundamental risk. And basis for categorizing the risk. Internal and external risks. There are two general classifications of risk, external and internal. The classifications differentiate between the ability of the company or project team to control the risk. External risks are risks the company or project team cannot control. Frequently these risks are also strategic and may affect the economy or many companies. Examples of external risks include force majeure risks such as hurricanes, price changes due to market forces, and major labor strikes. The company or project cannot control the occurrence of external risk, but can mitigate the impact if the risk occurs. Internal risks are risks the company or project team can control. Examples of internal risks are ineffectual contractor due to flawed selection process, design errors due to using untrained personnel, and cost overruns due to excessive project changes. These risks are also tactical in the sense they can be controlled by the project team, group, or members of the team. The company or project can control the occurrence of internal risks and can mitigate the impact if the risk occurs. We shall discuss internal and external risks specific to capital project in next 2 slides. In this slide we shall talk about external risks, their types and examples. Before we talk about it, let us first recap what is external risk. We understood in previous slide that external risks are the risks that company or project team cannot control. However, they can mitigate the impact, fully or partially, if such risk events occurs. Now let's go to type of risks. The first type we have here is natural hazard. The example of natural hazards can be storm, flood, fire, tornado, earthquakes and so on. New or revised government regulations is also an external risk. Example for such external risks can be, environmental changes or issues, change and design standards, project specifications, product pricing, taxes etc. We have some other external risks like market conditions. Act of deliberate intent, example of this can be vandalism, sabotage, terrorism etc. Indirect effect occurring as a result of project, like, environmental impact, social impacts. Contract vendor performance, and the examples can be shortage of qualified contractors vendors. Quality of their work. Bankruptcy of vendors or contractors. Contract claims. Schedule slippage etc. There can be other external risk to a project like financial, legal and technical. There can be many other external risks to the project beyond the list shown here. As discussed earlier, internal risks are those risks whose occurrences and impact can be controlled by the project team. Let's review the types and examples of internal risks. First, type of internal risks to a project can be management problems. The example of management problems risks can be numerous, such as loss of control, unresolved conflicts like of policies and procedures, inadequate planning, inadequate personnel, changing priorities, management turnover, unclear and unrealistic goals, poor definitions of roles and responsibilities, not understanding the complexity of projects, etc. Schedule delays are one of the other internal risks. This can be caused by several problems, such as management problems as discussed before. Unrealistic schedules, regulatory approvals, labor shortage, unforeseen site conditions, lack of scope definitions, project changes etc. Another and very common internal risk to a project is cost overrun. This can be due to management problems, inappropriate procurement strategy, contractor or vendor claims, inexperienced workforce, labor negotiations, errors in cost estimate, unrealistic cost budgets etc. One of the other internal risks is technical quality-related risk. This risk and the cost by several reasons such as shortage of trained and experienced design professionals, new technology, design that cannot be built, inappropriate designer standard, facility too expensive to build and so on. Note that there can be several others internal risks to the project. As explained in the previous slides, one of the steps of risk management is to identify the risks of the project. This risk can be both internal and external. Risk assessment. Risk assessment is the next step in risk management. The objective of risk assessment is to establish the relative importance and impact of the risk item. Assessment allows the team to prioritize the risk items. Each risk item is assessed a probability of occurrence and a potential impact. Now let us discuss how risk assessment is typically performed. First step is to describe the risk we have identified in previous step of risk identification. Next step is to determine the probability of occurrence, and the step after this is to identify the potential impact. In order to determine the relative occurrence of probability and potential impact, a scale can be developed. This scale can be in the terms of high, medium, low scale. Other more refined scales such as 1 to 5, or 1 to 10 can be also used. The high, medium, low is easy because individuals and teams can come to a quicker decision on assessment with a more compact scale. Let us take a small example, and understand how the risk assessment is done. Let us assume that there is a major risk of fire at a project site. So we'll write a risk description as major fire at project site. Let's say it is a greenfield, or new refinery project, adjacent to an existing refinery. This means that while catching a major fire during the construction is not highly probable. However, if this happens, this can cause severe damage as the fire can spread into the existing refinery. So, in the probability of occurrence column, we shall give risk a medium ranking. As the occurrence of fire can have severe impacts, therefore, we shall put this on high scale on potential impact. In order to understand the scale, let's discuss what we mean by high, medium, low scale in more detail. The probability of occurrence is usually straightforward. Potential criteria on occurrence could: high. Very likely, the risk item will occur, for example, greater than 75%. Medium. The risk item may or may not occur, for example, 25 to 75%, and low. Unlikely that the risk item will occur, for example, less than 25%. The percentages are only illustrative of an approach. The occurrence assessment is almost always subjective and can't usually be calculated. However, the percentages indicated would serve to distribute items across all three categories. Establishing the occurrence criteria is up to the team, and may have been outlined in the risk planning documents. Assessing the probability of occurrence is best done in a group, where the assessments can be discussed and challenged. Now let us talk about impact criteria. The risk plan should identify the impact criteria. Examples of potential criteria for impact are the following. High, greater than 1% of project cost. Medium, from 0.1 to 1% of project cost. And low, up to 0.1% of project cost. Impact usually means financial impact, although other impacts can be used, such as days of delay or other important project parameters. The criteria for high, medium, low should be established instead of gauging this for each item. Similar to the probability of occurrence, the impact assessment can be either subjective or calculated. Many teams provide a rough impact assessment and, if necessary, will later do further investigation or calculation. Analysis. The first part of analysis is the review of the risk items. The review confirms the occurrence and impact assessments were completed, and were consistent with the established criteria for each. There may be reasons to consider the combining or splitting of risk items. Responsibility and control of the mitigation are good reasons to consider changing items. Analysis is a good time to refine the cost impact assessments on items where the scope is unclear. Investigation of cost assessments may be helpful later. The main objective of analysis is the selection of risk items for mitigation. Many techniques are available for this purpose. It is possible to make a selection from the list and proceed. It is also possible to perform a calculation to give each risk item a score. Occurrence impact matrix is the most common method of risk analysis. We shall discuss this in detail in the next slide. Let us discuss the occurrence impact matrix in the detail. This is also called risk mitigation chart. The matrix uses the high, medium, low assessments for each risk item to establish the criteria for mitigation. The highly medium-low assessment is basically based upon the risk assessment step that we have discussed in earlier slide. The matrix is usually used as shown in figure on the slide. On the x-axis we have probability of occurrence. As we go from left to right, the probability of occurrence increases, from low to high. Similarly, on y-axis we have impact on project. As we go from bottom to top, the impact due to occurrence of risk on the project increases. Let us take the same example of fire at site to understand how to use probability impact risk metrics, and determine criteria for mitigation of a particular risk. As noted in the risk assessment, the probability of occurrence of this risk is medium, however, the potential impact of this risk is high. Therefore, this risk items shall fit into this particular cell of the risk mitigation chart. As highlighted, this risk should be reviewed for mitigation. Similarly, there can be several other combination of probability of occurrence and impact. For example, a risk item that had a high impact and a high occurrence would be a high. As the chart shows, this item would be reviewed for mitigation. It is up to the project to determine the item approach according to the matrix. Some projects may feel it is appropriate to mitigate all items that have a high impact on the project or to probably accept all items that have a low impact on the project. Mitigation. Once a risk item is selected for mitigation during analysis, a risk mitigation technique would be chosen. It is assumed the risk items selected will be acted upon or placed in a priority list. Such listing would be done in such a way that they will potentially be acted upon, depending on resources. Some mitigation items may require a review of different techniques to select the optimal solution. Methods of mitigating risk include the following: avoidance, prevention, reduction, transfer, hedging, and insurance. We shall discuss each of these mitigation methods through examples in next few slides. First, and the easiest method to mitigate risk is avoidance. In the simplest form, the risk avoidance is not doing something that entails risk. In project setting, avoidance can be done by structuring the project so that the risk is avoided. For example, you are a project manager of a high-rise building. Your designer suggests you a new type of foundation design that can save up to 30% of foundation cost. But the method has not been used in the region so far. You know design failure may jeopardize whole project. Therefore, you avoid the risk of design failure, and you decide to not use the new design, and use the conventional one. Other examples of risk avoidance may include project relocation, cancellation, delay, restructure, and redesign. Prevention is another risk mitigation mechanism. In project setting, this is done by structuring the project so that the risk is prevented. In other words, you take the risk and carry risky business or activity. However, you put in place some mechanism in place so that the risk does not occur, or, if it does, the severity is reduced. Let us take a small example to understand prevention as risk mitigation mechanism. Say, we are storing inflammable material at project site. At the time of storing such material, we know that such materials may lead to fire hazard. But we store such material at designated areas. This avoids inflammable materials getting into contact with fire, or high temperature. We also keep adequate fire extinguisher and other fire prevention devices so that in case of fire the fire can be controlled, and the damage can be minimized. By doing this we are preventing the risk of occurrence of fire. Other examples of risk prevention include safety and security measures, and redesign. Hazardous operations design reviews are good examples of risk prevention in engineering and design offices. Reduction. Risk prevention method focuses to avoid the occurrence of risk event. However, risk reduction focuses on the reduction of the overall impact due to the occurrence of the risk event. In our previous example of storing inflammable material, we may choose to keep the minimum inflammable material at site. By doing so, in the worst eventuality of fire, the damage from fire is reduced. This is an example of risk reduction. Transfer. A common method of risk mitigation is to transfer the risk to an organization that is more competent or willing to assume it. The transfer is usually accomplished by contract. All owners, contractors, and subcontractors have a collective share of the total project risk. There are two parts to the assumption of these risks. The company is technically qualified and financially prepared to accept the consequences. Project claims are a good example of the misunderstanding of who is at risk and who accepts the consequences. Hedging is a specialized way of transferring the risk. This is done where the risk of price fluctuations is assumed by a speculator through the purchasing and selling of futures contracts. In the is assumed the commodity futures contracts are covered by an organized exchange. Examples include crude oil, fuel oil, and foreign currency. Purchase orders for equipment or material in foreign currency can be fixed by the purchase of currency futures. Insurance is a well-known risk mitigation method. In this method, part of risk is transferred to companies that indemnify parties against specific losses in return for premiums. Most mitigation actions are avoidance, prevention, and reduction. Many organizations establish a standard approach to project execution in the areas of transfer, hedging, and insurance. This helps to do risk management planning at the time the project team is engaged in the project initial stage. If risk management begins early in project development, transfer and hedging may be important considerations. In the previous slides we understood how the risk mitigation can be done. This is time to understand how to implement the risk mitigation methodology selected in the step of risk mitigation. Figure on the slide shows a typical risk mitigation flow chart. This describes a generic method of implementing risk mitigation. The first step is to describe the mitigation actions. This shall include the type of mitigation strategies that are identified in the previous step. The next step is to determine the cost estimate or budget to implement the mitigation strategy. This can be categorized into a high, medium, or low category. Next step is to determine the probability of success. Again, this can be categorized also into a high, medium, or low category. The cost to mitigate can be relatively straightforward to estimate or calculate. A high, medium, or low category is easy to assign and easy to understand. The overall objective of this analysis is to identify risk mitigation method which attracts low costs and high probability of success. In other words, getting the most money for what we spent on mitigation. At the end of step 1, 2 and 3, we will generate a priority list of mitigation strategies. Based on the priority listing, a decision shall be taken on the implementation of particular risk mitigation strategy. This decision shall also depend on the availability of resources. Ranking mitigation items also helps in deciding to what extent the project is able to execute its mitigation actions. If a particular risk mitigation strategy is chosen, then it would be helpful to describe items that, if mitigated, would be the responsibilities of a group, department, or individual. In other words, the responsibilities and actions for mitigation implementation should be defined. Finally, it should be also identified when the mitigation item needs to be completed, especially if the action is time-dependent. Follow-up. Risk management is most effective if it is monitored, controlled, and adjusted as required. Taking the time to have meetings and establish the risk management plan is wasted if the work is completed, put in a notebook, and ignored until one of the risk items occurs without the mitigation being performed. Regular monitoring and updating of risk management progress should be part of a regular cycle of project activities. Monthly or quarterly reviews and status reporting of risk mitigation is recommended. Quantitative risk analysis. Quantitative risk analysis is the use of mathematical techniques and models to numerically establish the probability of risk and the consequences of risk. The most common of these techniques are simulation, sensitivity analysis, and decision tree analysis. We shall discuss each method in detail in next few slides. Simulation. A simulation is the development of a model of the uncertainties of project in terms of cost or time, and the effect on the project. One of the most used cost and time quantitative risk analysis simulation method is Monte Carlo simulation. Monte Carlo simulation is a computerized mathematical technique that allows people to account for risk in quantitative analysis and decision-making. Monte Carlo simulation performs risk analysis by building models of possible results. By substituting a range of values, in the other words a probability distribution, for any factor that has inherent uncertainty. It then calculates results over and over, each time using a different set of random values from the probability functions. Depending upon the number of uncertainties and the ranges specified for them, a Monte Carlo simulation could involve thousands, or tens of thousands of recalculations, before it is complete. Monte Carlo simulation produces distributions of possible outcome values. The general approach to simulation using the Monte Carlo method is: the first step is develop a model for simulation. The models can be two types. First, cost estimate. This is based upon work breakdown structure for the project. Second type is schedule. This is based upon network diagram, or critical path diagram. When the model is complete, the second step is to select the group for analysis. For cost variables, the group can be various level of cost accounts. For schedule or time, the grouping can be done at activities, high-level summaries, or management level of schedule. Next step is to identify uncertainty in the model for the selected group of analysis. This consists of two sub-steps of, select the probability distributions and provide inputs, and, identify the form of the results. Next step is to analyze the model with simulation. This is done using help of computer software. The software performs thousands and thousands of iteration, and generates a probability distribution outcome of cost, or time for the project. And the last step is to generate simulation reports, and analyze information. Detailed training on Monte Carlo simulation is beyond the scope of this course. Therefore, we would restrict discussion to concepts only. Sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis is the substitution of variables in a risk model, to test the effects of change of the variable on overall model output. This is easily accomplished with the wide availability of software, such as Microsoft Excel. Sensitivity analysis is also referred to as what-if analysis. For example, in cost items, one can substitute various quantities and unit costs to test the sensitivity of risk items to changes. Concern would be raised if small changes result in large effects on the costs. We shall use a simple example to understand how sensitivity analysis works. Let us go to the table shown on the slide. On the first column of the table we have shown three different scenarios of a particular cost model. The first is the base, and then we have two different scenarios, namely sensitivity 1 and sensitivity 2. Let us first go to base case. This is the normal situation, which shows the basic cost model for a small production, say a 1,000 pencils. In order to produce 1,000 pencils, we shall require 1,000 labor units. Here labor unit cost is $1 each, and the cost of material for each pencil is $1. Therefore, the total cost of production of pencils will be $2,000. Now let's go to the scenario of sensitivity 1. Here we have to determine the cost when we are producing 200 more pencils. In this scenario both the number of labor units and material units shall increase. Therefore, the total revised cost would be $2,400. That would be 20% uplift from the base cost. This shows how the total cost is sensitive towards additional unit produced. Let us go to next scenario of sensitivity 2. In this scenario the cost of labor is increased to $1.50 per unit from the base rate of $1 per unit. With this the total cost would be $2,500. This is 25% uplift over the original base cost of $2,000. This percentage uplift shows how much total cost is sensitive to the increase in the labor cost. If we compare scenario 1 and 2, we shall find that, if we increase the production by 20%, the cost shall increase by 20%. Whereas, if we increase the labor cost by 50%, the cost of production shall increase by 25%. Decision tree analysis. Decision tree analysis methods are techniques to evaluate and compare the probabilities and financial results of investment choices. Decision tree analysis is a diagram that shows the costs, probability, and financial consequences of taking certain decisions with mutually exclusive options. The diagram shows the decision points and the costs for taking each decision. Decision trees are easy to set up and calculate. They are most useful when the decision costs and probabilities are established by knowledgeable individuals. Performing the calculations on all paths of the decision yields all of the expected monetary values. The value with the lowest cost or greatest savings should be given the highest priority. Contingency. Contingency is an amount added to an estimate, or schedule to allow for changes, that experience shows will likely be required. Contingency may be derived from either the statistical analysis of past project costs or schedules, or by applying experience from similar projects. It usually excludes changes in scope, or unforeseeable major events such as strikes, earthquakes, etc. To reflect the view of contingency with respect to this lecture, contingency is the amount of resources added to the project, cost or schedule, which satisfies the risk approach to the business and the project. Contingency, cost and schedule, is one of the most frequent outputs of risk management. Contingency derived from a well-executed risk analysis could be a powerful project control tool. Contingency also allows management to select the risk level appropriate to the company's approach to its business. If the business is risky and the opportunity is large, the desire to assume risk may be greater than businesses that are risk-adverse and more conservative. The use of risk management techniques and risk analysis allows projects to proceed on the basis of both a qualitative and quantitative assessment of project variability. All the organizations and projects need to deal with risk to succeed. In this lecture we understood the concepts and tools and techniques of risk management. In this lecture we learned the typical sequence of risk management, which is identification, assessment, analysis, and mitigation. Risk management in the project or organization can be performed in several ways. Typically, risk management steps are planning, identification, assessment, analysis, mitigation and follow-up. Risk analysis can be done both quantitatively and qualitatively. Qualitative method includes simulation, sensitivity analysis, and decision tree analysis. Contingency is one of the related knowledge areas of risk management. Contingency is an amount added to an activity, or schedule to allow for changes, that experience shows will likely to be required.